Chapter 4: The Creation of the Apartheid State. What was apartheid? The National Party gained majority power in the 1948 election and began to institute a system of apartheid in which the different races in South Africa were segregated as much as possible. The concept of apartheid was established on 4 principles. 1. South Africa comprised 4 racial groups, each with its own inherent and separate culture. 2. Whites were the civilized race and were entitled to absolute power over the interests of all others. 3. The white race was a single entity, including both Afrikaners and English speakers. 4. Black Africans were made up of different tribes. This is important because it implies that Africans are different from each other and should be kept separate so that each tribe can maintain its own culture. Also, so homogeneous whites could call themselves the majority. It was not believed that it was necessary to provide separate but equal facilities. Soon after 1948, laws were enacted which determined which race one belonged to and in turn determined someone's life. The bureaucracy was growing as a result of implementing apartheid policy. White South Africans benefited from apartheid as it ensured them the majority of wealth in the country and the well-paid white-collar jobs. The forms of apartheid are grand apartheid, which refers to the overall policy to keep the different races as separated as possible, for example, ensuring that they lived in different areas. Petty apartheid referred to the day-to-day restrictions such as separate facilities and restrictions, aka the segregation between the races. History before 1948. Before European colonization, there were many different tribes. The Portuguese were the first to colonize South Africa, but the Dutch East Trading Company came in 1652 and pushed through inland. European settlers began to set up farms and trafficked African slaves. Early European colonization. Africans, and they called themselves the Boers, moved inland away from the British colonial rule, which had outlawed slavery during the Great Trek. They made an oath with God for a victory during battle with the Zulus, and they now believed that God granted them the land of South Africa. Boers created 2 republics, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, based on the values of hard work, stern Christianity, and extreme racism. The Gold Rush and the Boer Wars. Gold was discovered in 1867 and 1868, and this led to the Second Boer War in 1899, which the British won in 1902 and absorbed the republics and created the Union of South Africa in 1910. This became a self-governing dominion within the British Empire. The racial makeup of South Africa. First, the Africans. Land was taken away from them, and they could only vote in the Cape, and they dealt with discrimination. Policies kept things segregated. Africans from whites and Africans from Africans. 80% lived in rural areas and were sharecroppers. Whites wanted cheap labor for the mines, and they forced laws so Africans were pushed off of land to be exploited for labor. Indians. 150,000 people imported for agricultural labor. Some became merchants and were viewed as outsiders. Colored people lived overwhelmingly in the Cape area. Many owned land, could vote, and spoke Afrikaans and English. Whites generally were the only people who could vote. Elections were between white political parties, more Afrikaners than English speakers, and the National Party's apartheid supported Afrikaner interests. The segregation era from 1910 to 1948. Afrikaners and English speakers agreed that Africans were racially inferior. Laws were passed to impose segregation and to reduce Africans as far as possible to the role of cheap labor, and they were unable to compete with whites. Acts prior to 1948. A series of acts were created prior to 1948 to secure white power. The 1911 Mines and Works Act, the 1911 Natives Labor Regulation Act, which required Africans to carry passbooks, 1913 Natives Land Act, 1923 Natives Urban Areas Act, required Africans working in industry to live in townships. 1924 Industrial Consolation Act, 1927 Native Administration Act, which set up the Department of Native Affairs, otherwise known as the Native Affairs Department. 1936 Native Trust and Land Act, 1936 Representation of the Natives Act. White justification for segregation. Whites based their views on 2 factors. 1. Ignorance and fear of the consequences for their own position and indeed safety if Africans were given political and economic rights. 2. A need to feel reassured that segregation was in Africa's best interest. They believed that Africans themselves wanted a simple pastoral environment. The reserves. The reserves focus on the fact that Africans were most happy on them. The reserves were too small, so there was a lot of overflow in the creation of black spots off of the reserves. Transient migration and urbanization. 1925, Africans over 18 had to pay a dwelling tax, and this created a system of transient migration. They had to take out a loan and then leave to find work to repay the loan. 500,000 left the reserves and worked in mines and lived in compounds. Work. Compounds. Africans lived in single-sex barracks and no families allowed. Contracts were created between 9 and 18 months for 8-hour shifts, 12 cents a day plus meals, but the workers' health was often broken before the 18 months ended. Urbanization. Influx control, which was the goal of the National Party, was outweighed because of the need for cheap labor. Africans migrated to urban areas to work in mines and lived as transient workers. Rapid industrialization created shanty towns, which lacked all accommodations. South Africa and political power. There were two main political parties, the United Party, which was English speakers, and the National Party, which was Afrikaners. South Africa was still under British dominion, so the British government appointed the governor and House of Parliament, and women couldn't vote until 1930. D.F. Malan. D.F. Malan was the minister of the Dutch Reformed Church and was anti-British. He was the editor of the Afrikaner newspaper and worked as a minister of the Interior. He created the Purified National Party in opposition to the merging of the National Party and the South African Party. Political allegiance in South Africa after World War II. Afrikaners supported Nazi Germany, while English speakers supported the Allies. The Purified National Party pushed the Afrikaner identity. They were pro-Nazi and anti-Semitic. The United Party favored joining the war for the Allies, while some Afrikaners openly supported the Nazis. Economic effects of World War II. Whites who went to fight needed replacement. Labor laws were relaxed, and increase of African workers in manufacturing and construction. Africans did low-skill work and were paid less. In 1942, laws were passed to educate Africans in urban areas to become more skilled workers.
The 1948 election. The 1948 election was fought between the HNP in coalition with the Afrikaner Party and the United Party in coalition with the South African Labour Party. The HNP won the election and renamed itself the National Party. The Afrikaner Party was absorbed within it. Even though the National Party did not win the popular vote, the United Party gained 524,230 votes over the National Party's 401,834. The National Party gained more MPs. An MP is a member of South Africa's parliament. Reasons for the National Party victory. Smuts, the leader of the United Party, was old and tired. The United Party was very poorly organized, and the unfair tactics which led National Party candidates to accuse their opponents, particularly Jan Hofmeyr, of supporting racial integration, the photos of Jan Smuts, the United Party leader. In his campaign, D.F. Malan criticized Smuts for allowing the influx of black and colored people into white areas seen during the war years. Most white people argued that the races should be segregated as much as humanly possible. However, they recognized that there was a need for cheap labor and that the country should be strictly governed in the interests of the white minority. And D.F. Malan was a politician who formed South Africa's first exclusively Afrikaner government and instituted the policy of apartheid. The National Party government, 1948 to 1953. The new government had two main aims: to impose white supremacy through an all-embracing system of apartheid, as well as to end political ties with Great Britain and form a republic. The National Party was to win every election until the demise of apartheid in 1994, and its support grew over the period from 1948 to 1964. The photo on the slide is of the National Party after their election victory on May 28, 1948. This slide is a summary diagram of the 1948 election, which saw the National Party coalition against the United Party coalition.
Solomon Plaatje was an African elite who spoke 7 languages and worked as a court interpreter in Mafeking and aided British intelligence during the Boer War. Plaatje met with other middle-class African elites in Bloemfontein in the Orange Free State in January 1912. The meeting created the South African Native National Congress, or SANNC, which became the African National Congress, ANC, in 1923. Plaatje was their first secretary. Their first president was John L. Dubé, a Christian minister with an American education and who was greatly influenced by Booker T. Washington. Washington said blacks needed help from whites to elevate themselves. Consistent with Booker T. Washington's philosophy, the SANNC believed they should look to Britain for help. In May of 1913, Governor-General Lord Gladstone, who held political jurisdiction over South Africa, refused to meet with members of the SANNC. In response, in 1914, the SANNC sent delegation to London to meet with Colonial Secretary Lord Harcourt, who took weeks to only tell them that this was an issue for the government of South Africa, not of Britain. In 1918, the SANNC gathered 7,000 signatures and petitioned King George V in protest of continued racism. They mentioned that 17,000 South Africans helped Britain fight German troops during World War I in East Africa, and another 25,000 on the Western Front. They received no reply. Unlike ANC members, most black Africans were illiterate and had no concept of nationhood, so the ANC's pamphlets were useless. The ANC continuously worked towards improving the quality of life for workers and was heavily involved in local and regional disputes. Gaining African support was difficult because of all the different languages in South Africa, the high illiteracy rate, differing concerns among rural versus urban Africans, and the fact that many saw themselves as part of distinct and divided tribes rather than one single entity, which made controlling them much easier for the colonizers. J.T. Gumede was elected president of the ANC in 1927, but was defeated in his re-election campaign in 1930 because of his willingness to work with the Communist Party of South Africa, CPSA, which would later change its name to the SACP, the South African Communist Party. Beginning in 1940, the new ANC president Alfred Zuma, the ANC began working with other organizations, such as the South African Indian Conference. Nelson Mandela is the most famous of ANC leaders, and was the first democratically elected of a unified South Africa in May 1994. Frustrations that the ANC's demands were not being met led to increasing radicalization within the ANC, leading to Walter Sisulu's formation of the ANCYL, or ANC Youth League, in 1943. Some members of the ANCYL believed in Africanism, which said that Africans should gain freedom without the help of other races, including Indians. Africanism was very important in anti-apartheid movements in the 1950s. In 1948, they created the Basic Policy in an attempt to deal with tribal distinctions and bring about more unity in Africans. In 1949, the ANCYL formalized the Basic Policy into a program of action, which rejected white domination, supported African nationalism through all of Africa, not just South Africa, asserted African pride to counteract white supremacy, and demanded mass, direct action.
Workers' rights protests. Bus boycotts in 1943 and 1947 were effective at reinstating lower bus fares. Squatters in the outskirts of Johannesburg set up their own local government in 1944. In 1946, the African Mine Workers Union, the AMWU, held 21,000 members and led 100,000 workers to strike for higher wages. By the late 1920s, the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union, the ICU, held over 100,000 members and held a miners' strike of 70,000 in 1920. Communist Party of South Africa, CPSA. The Communist Party of South Africa was founded in 1921 and sought racial equality before it would move towards establishing communism, and there was willing to work with other organizations such as the ANC. Relations with the ANC were ambivalent in the interwar period, strained in the 1930s, and were much better in the 1940s. The CPSA was outlawed in 1950, so they began meeting illegally under the name of the South African Communist Party, the SACP. The South African Indian Congress, the SAIC. The SAIC was founded in 1919, but before then, Gandhi worked in South Africa as a lawyer and helped in creating several Indian organizations in Natal and Transvaal. The SAIC became more radical in the 1940s and advocated for passive resistance and formed a formal alliance with the ANC in March 1947.